Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, we've reached the final episode in our short series about ideas of globalization and what that means in the age of Trump. And today, I'm talking to the economist Dani Rodrik, who, at the beginning of this century, the 21st century, published a series of extraordinarily influential arguments trying to explain the challenge of 21st century globalization. Indeed, what had gone wrong with it, which features of it were not going to work. I'm talking to him now about those arguments, about how he sees them in retrospect, but also how he makes sense of what is happening in 2025. Dani, this is part of a series we're looking at globalization across the last 175 years and different ways of understanding it. If we think of the period after, say, 1990 or 1991, with hindsight, is it true to say, when we look back now, that there was a step change? I mean, there was clearly a step change in the use of the term globalization by politicians, in the ubiquity of a sense that something had happened. But had something actually happened so that we can say there's a before and after around 1990?
I think definitely so. I mean, I think there is a misconception that the post-war decades were kind of an ongoing sort of continuous deepening of globalization. But I do think after the 1990s, there was a qualitative change in the way that mainstream politicians and technocrats started to think about the relationship between their own economies and societies on the one hand and the global economy on the other. I think with a little bit of exaggeration, I would say that before 1990, I think the tendency was to view the world economy as a vehicle for enhancing domestic economic performance and social cohesion, whereas after 1990, the priorities were reversed and the question became, how can we alter our economy and our societal practices to join the world economy? In other words, the ends and means were reversed. The world economy went from being the means to becoming an end. And increasingly, policymakers were asking, what do we need to do to join the world economy to become more competitive? And interestingly, I think the center left and the center right converge on that question. I think some of the answers that they gave to that question differed. The left would emphasize education, investment in infrastructure. The right would emphasize cutting the red tape and the bureaucracy and fiscal restraint. But ultimately, the question was, how do we join the world economy? What do we need to do to open up and be part of the world economy and compete effectively? And I think you see this, the institutional embodiment of this change was, on the one hand, the creation of the World Trade Organization after 1994, which embodied a very different sense of what trade agreements were to be like compared to the GATT. And on the financial front, the emergence of financial globalization as a kind of a norm that countries were supposed to become open to finance and manage their tax regime and fiscal and monetary policy subject to that constraint rather than manage international finance, which had been the expectation in the previous decades under the Bretton Woods regime.
How much of it was a conscious political choice? So when I think of a politician like Tony Blair, so a classic centre-left politician of this period, he would say to his party, who were often quite reluctant to go down this road, trying to resist globalization is like trying to stop the tide from coming in, trying to dress it up as something beyond, in a sense, the sort of choice that politicians like him might have been expected to make in the past. And yet, whether it's 1990 specifically, but that period, this is clearly a new era in world politics too. This is the post-Cold War world. And in a way, it's too much of a coincidence for this simply everyone at the same time to realize we don't have a political choice about this, in the sense that one has to feel somewhere behind this were conscious political actors making deliberate decisions. Yet it wasn't presented like that.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned Tony Blair. I mean, they often use one of his quotes. I think it was from a Labour Party Congress where he's actually addressing the rank and file and trade unionists. Basically, he says, look, and then there are these protesters outside. They're protesting about globalization. And he says, I don't understand what all these protesters, what are they protesting? It's sort of like discussing what globalization ought to look like is like discussing whether autumn should follow summer. So it was this notion of automaticity. And around the time, it's very similar. This is in the early 2000s. You have very similar statements coming out from American center-left politicians as well. There's a quote that I use from Bill Clinton where he says, globalization is like, wind and water. It's like the physical equivalent of, our economic life. So there are all these physical metaphors that suggest that there is something unchangeable in this, that you just need to just adjust to it. There's nothing, you can stop or you can debate or change. But of course, the paradox is that this was very much a decision. It was, when the OECD decided to enshrine free capital mobility as one of its guiding norms, there was a policy decision when, you negotiated world trade agreements, whether in the WTO or in bilateral trade treaties, with rules and regulations that went significantly beyond domestic tariffs and quotas, reaching into domestic regulations. That was an explicit choice. So I think deep down, these politicians understood that they were making policy choices, but I think found it convenient to present it as if we really have no choice. And I think that's really an important hint to the backlash that was to come, because if you constantly tell people who are unhappy and who are feeling they're being left behind and who think that their politicians are not paying attention to their anxieties, if you keep telling them that you have to take it in the chin because there's really nothing we can do, this is like wind and water or the atmosphere, essentially, and people feel that if somebody else comes to them and says, we're going to give you control for a change, then, can you blame people for buying into the narrative that the populists came with that said that we'll take back control?
When this step change happened, it's not just a before and after story. Before, nation states were the priority. Afterwards, the global economy was the priority. There were still serious constraints, even if we want to call it, I don't know if you're comfortable with the word hyperglobalization. It sounds a little hyper, a little exaggerated, but let's call it that phase of step change globalization. There were still many constraints on the workings of a global economy and global economic integration. Do you want to just tell us a bit about that? Because it does also create a slightly false picture, doesn't it? The idea that somehow there's a before and an after.
No, I think it's mostly in the mentality and the mindset. So some of the things you could do beforehand, you couldn't do after, and that was explicitly written into the rules. For example, in the 1970s and 1980s, when there were these periodic surges in trade flows that tended to upset social bargains or create local labor market dislocations in the advanced countries, the response would tend to be, let's get together with the exporting countries and negotiate these temporary trade deals where they slow down how much they're selling us. And so we can adjust in the meantime. And if they play, then we'll give them some of the quota rents. So in some sense, everybody wins. And so you had the multi-fiber arrangement in the 1970s, which slowed down the growth of garment and textile exports from what was then called the newly industrializing countries. In the 1980s, you had these voluntary export restraints placed on exports of Japanese autos and steel and a few other things. And free trade economists would look at these things and call it protectionism, but it was really regime maintenance. It was doing what you need to do to ensure that, the underlying support for a moderately open world economy was not lost. Once the World Trade Organization was created, these kinds of voluntary trade, voluntary export restrictions and similar arrangements were explicitly made illegal by world trade rules. So that was an example. So then you have this export surge from China in the 2000s. 2 or 3 decades earlier, the response would have been, let's manage trade a little bit so that, we don't create political problems at home. In the 2000s, we got the politicians, including center-left politicians, saying just, there's nothing we can do. This is how the world economy works. It's like wind and water. But of course, deeper down, it's not like, the WTO doesn't have an army to tell you to send to prevent you from, doing things. It was just, deep down, these norms that were internalized in the cognitive map that these politicians had taken on was one where, this is not how good governments behave. They just keep their borders open. They try to compensate the losers to the extent that they can. But it's like the idea that we would actually try to manage trade. But broader, of course, you're also right that there are many areas of international exchange that were heavily regulated. We had significant restrictions on the movement of workers, which is something that in the gold standard, the earlier version of globalization, we did not have. And many of these trade agreements were, of course, thousands and thousands of pages of rules and regulations. So there's also a kind of a power structure behind all of that. So whose power is, who has the leverage over the rules. So if the banks and international corporations were basically getting what they wanted, developing countries less so, and probably, workers, especially the ununionized workers or workers in the informal sector in developing countries weren't getting much at all.
My memory of the period when China's growing integration into the world economy, was becoming visible not just to politicians but to voters, was presented as more evidence that globalization is inevitable. Here's this country, this society, this system that looks like it's very different from ours. But look, in the end, we're coming together. So particularly through the 2000s, beyond 2010, so David Cameron and George Osborne in this country, that government very much presented China as evidence that it's not quite like the weather, but it's not far off the weather. This is the direction of travel. And yet, with hindsight, it looks like we should have been telling a different story, which is this isn't evidence of a single global economic system underlying what might look like surface political differences, but deep political differences underlying what might look like a single global economic system. Did the politicians misread it, or has there been a change even in the last, say, decade that tells a different story, would you say?
I think it was a misreading. I mean, I think China, of course, is really the embodiment of the internal contradictions of the spirit of hyperglobalization. China was both the leading edge of the internal inequalities and divisions and cleavages that were being created during this period, but also externally became the symbol of a changing power balance. And as soon as China became significantly important as an actor, it turned from an economic opportunity into a geopolitical rival. And it should have been obvious to all that the standard line on China, and Bill Clinton explicitly said that the strongest argument for bringing China into the World Trade Organization was that this would make China more democratic and that they would become more like us. And therefore, this was not just good for economics, but it was good for politics and democracy and the international order. I don't know anybody with any sort of serious understanding of political and institutional developments that would have necessarily made that leap. But it was also clear that even before Xi, that you can look at what the Chinese policies under Deng and successors, that China was a country that was pursuing policies that were much more consistent with the earlier model of globalization, the Bretton Woods model, because China was doing things that were permissible under the Bretton Woods regime, but were no longer permissible under hyperglobalization. It still had high rates of protection for most goods. It violated intellectual property rights regularly. It managed its capital flows. It managed its exchange rate exchange. It engaged in a huge amount of industrial policies and state direction of the economy. So the paradox is that China, the greatest beneficiary supposedly of that hyperglobalization era, was actually playing globalization by a very different set of rules than you were supposed to play in the hyperglobalization era. And that works fine as long as Americans and the Europeans were under this sort of consumerist notion that, well, ultimately what matters are just consumer welfare. If we're getting cheap goods from China, that's nothing to complain about. And so that seemed to be fine. And some people are losing jobs or, economic anxieties are mounting. Well, that's, they'd better adjust, move somewhere else where the jobs are, get an education and so forth. there was this period for two or 2.5 decades where it looked like this could have gone on, but there was this inherent tension that, the greatest beneficiaries of the system were actually playing by very different rules that the system that was based on. And by contrast, of course, countries that were living by the rules weren't doing all that well. That's true for developing countries like Mexico that made hyperglobalization its development strategy, did very, very poorly. Or, the advanced countries where the gains were distributed very, very unevenly, and of course, then eventually produced a backlash.
And again, this is hindsight, but it feels like it's not just hindsight. As you said earlier, politicians who say this is like the weather, it's a hostage to fortune, because when another politician comes along and says, no, actually, you have a choice, the argument becomes much harder to make. Also, we have here the next stage of that argument, which is, we see it now, this thing that they told you was a global system is not a global system because some people aren't playing by the rules. And as a political argument to make against the hyperglobalizers, it doesn't take a lot to see that could be very powerful. If the Chinese are playing by a previous set of rules, but under the auspices of this new system, if the people playing by the rules are doing badly, it is a very powerful populist argument to say playing by the rules is for suckers.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we could already see this even under the Biden administration. The Biden administration was very explicit that the rules no longer benefited the United States, and the U.S. was going to go on to a different model. But I think, the way, at least under the Biden administration, you could see that, okay, what we want to do, we still understand that the world economy is potential source of gains for everybody, but that we've gone overboard in one direction and simply assumed that by signing more free trade agreements that would raise all boats, and no, it didn't. The middle class really suffered, and therefore we need a more balanced type of globalization. So I always interpreted what the Biden administration was doing was in some sense taking a leaf out of the Chinese book, which is to say, we're not withdrawing from the world economy, but we want a better balance, going back to the spirit of the Bretton Woods arrangements, if you will. I mean, that would have been the logical conclusion. And it would have been actually a good thing, I think. Economies would be less deeply intertwined with each other, but a better balance between domestic economic social prerogatives and the requirements of international integration. Now, I think what happens with Trump is actually where the world economy becomes purely zero-sum. That is it's like if they're gaining, it must be because they're exploiting us, and that's, they're taking advantage of that. So it's really a terrible caricature, and I think it's one that's taking us down a very, very tragic path.
So we're going to come back to Trump, but I want to just take you back to Clinton, actually, and what you said about Clinton. So around 2000, you came up with a celebrated trilemma, the trilemma of the global economic order, which essentially said you can only have two of the following three things: global economic integration, one; national sovereignty, two; democracy, three. But as you said, Bill Clinton seemed to think that actually the first two lead to the third in a way. If you can integrate a sovereign Chinese state into the global economic order, it will result in democratization. And as you said, almost no one outside of a somewhat wishful set of thinkers believed that. When you characterize the trilemma, and I reread the 2000 piece recently, and what I was so struck by was that you had a long-term optimistic trajectory, so that there are various permutations of the two of the three. And you had a long-term optimistic trajectory towards the coming together of global economic integration and democracy, with the nation state in a way being sidelined. So a global federal political order which is democratic. In the short to medium term, so from 2000, say, to around now, you had a very pessimistic trajectory, which was much more likely that there would be backlashes against the attempt to bring these three things together. The pessimism looks pretty prophetic. Is the optimism still there when you think about the story in the long run? I mean, you were actually talking about a 100-year perspective, which is a very long time. I'd just love to get your sense of where we stand in relation to the trilemma in the light of that medium-term and long-term difference of perspective.
Yeah, I think my short-term or medium-term pessimism was based on my sense that the mainstream political forces were by and large ignoring the trilemma. That is, that they were acting as if it does not exist.
Clinton being a case in point.
Clinton, but also in Europe. I think Europe is where the European Union was, where the trilemma really, I think, bites. And mainstream leaders would never openly acknowledge it. They would, in fact, say, we're doing all these things, we'll get all three of those. And once I was at a meeting where a former finance minister of one of the Eurozone countries said, I think the reason that populists are winning is that they are the only ones who are willing to acknowledge the trilemma. They will explicitly reject the euro or deep economic integration. And they're very explicit that we can't have all these three things. Whereas, Bill Clinton or leaders in the United States and European Union leaders would keep on saying, no, we're not really giving up on any sovereignty. Yeah, of course, we're not giving up on democracy either. So it was like we can have all these three things. In that sense, I think, it was clear that this was going to produce a kind of a backlash. And it's a populist by being explicit about, of course, I would much rather in the European context, for example, see deeper economic integration and deepening European democracy, even if that means erosion of the nation state. But it doesn't mean, deepening democracy in a European way. And so that's the direction I hope Europe will eventually go.
Can I just ask you, when that finance minister said that, what was the response? Or did he just say it to you privately, or was it in the room? I mean, if he could see it, once you've seen that, it's quite hard to unsee it.
He said it publicly, so it wasn't just a private, but he was a former finance minister without planning to be in politics. I don't know what others thought, but I thought he put in words what I was suspecting. There's two things about the populists, I think, that makes them appealing. One is that they're very explicit that we are giving up something. And then secondly, in return, the idea that we'll give you back something, we will empower you, rather than simply saying, oh, no, we can't do this, we can't do that, this is constrained, this will cost too much, or we can't do that, which is sort of what the answer you get from the technocrats or the mainstream politicians. So the populists have been liberating, but of course, they offer fake solutions. And so that's why often I've said, so we need a populism of the left, which is truly democratic. And we have versions of that. I think in the US, Bernie Sanders and AOC kind of represent that, but hasn't been enough of a counterweight to the populism of the right.
When you look back to earlier periods of globalization, say at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, the gold standard period, one of the things that's true about it is there was, I think, quite a common understanding that one direction of travel for this is towards a global politics. It might not necessarily be democratic, because this was in lots of ways a pre-democratic age, but some versions of it were also democratic. The idea of a world state, a global state, or at least a globally integrated politics seemed back then to be something that, if not obvious, was at least one of the possible paths. And it is striking that in the hyper period, 1990s onwards, it does kind of fade away. There used to be talk about the democratic deficit in the European Union, but people got bored with it. It was like, that's just technocratic stuff. And yet, as you lay out the logic of the trilemma, it's both surprising and in some ways disappointing that it just disappears from political discourse. We didn't spend the period of hyperglobalization thinking about what would a global politics or a genuinely international politics look like that upheld democratic values.
So I myself am honestly of two minds. At some level, national sovereignty seems without much normative value. It seems like it only has functional value because you need some authority to enforce contracts and make sure rules are obeyed. But it's a very kind of a functional role without any necessarily deeply, normative value. I think there's a counter-argument on the role of the nation state as a seat for democratic experimentation. So that a global politics, what would that mean if it enables significant experimentation at the local level in terms of what the forms of institutions supporting a market economy should take? Then the global politics necessarily has to be a relatively thin one. It has to be a kind of a facilitating one, with a lot of the politics actually being at the national or subnational level. So I believe a world in which I think there ought to be significant amount of experimentations, or to put it in EU terms, the huge amount of subsidiarity, But if that is true, how much global politics you actually do need and how much effort you would need to invest in that seems unclear. What is clear is that the current configuration of nation states is totally arbitrary. That's still true. So how do you go to a system where you would encourage experimentation, institutional experimentation? Because I think there's a kind of a trade-off that it is true that a global politics and global federalism might maximize the economic integration that you would have, because if you have a single set of global institutions, then you get rid of institutional or jurisdictional discontinuities associated with national borders. You eliminate all the transactions costs that those borders create. But then you lose the ability to, have different institutions from your neighbors, because different institutional choices are precisely what, barriers to trade are in a deep sense. And so in an optimal world, we don't want to be in either corner, where all countries are completely free to design their own institutions, even if it cuts off trade completely. Or the other corner where we just, have completely free trade with institutional harmonization, where we're not giving, enough room for individual units to design their own institutions. So ultimately, I think we need to have somewhere in between where there is significant institutional experimentation and we fall far from a kind of an extreme hyperglobalization.
It does feel to me one of the notable features of the last 30 years is how little political institutional experimentation there's been in a world that is in many ways radically experimental socially because of technology, in many ways economically as well. Political institutional forms, if you take someone from 1990 and showed them our world, it would blow their minds because in so many ways, how we form friendships, relationships, how we interact with people, the level of global communication. But then you show them the politics and it would be, oh, you didn't think to change anything. And when I say don't change anything institutionally, sort of structurally, of course, there's been a lot of experimenting with some weird candidates, but that's a different kind of thing.
We still have the same old political party system, the same electoral system, the same structure of, parliaments and executives. And yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, I think there has been some ideas with AI and greater tools of deliberation and so forth, but not nearly enough. I do think that we will need a new type of political institutions to handle the kinds of dysfunction that social media and new technologies are creating. I mean, it's quite clear that social media is really generating kind of alternative realities and alternative worlds for people of truth. And how do you, if you don't have some basic agreement on the facts, it's very difficult to have liberal democracies function. And how do we solve that I think, is really a huge political question.
One of the things that I think I see repeating itself from the 90s to now, and I'm going to use Blair as an example of this, because he's still going, he's still in Britain, not a huge public figure, but he makes pronouncements. He's very influential in the current British Labour administration. And he talks now about AI and technology exactly as he talked about globalization in the 90s. That is, he says, trying to resist it is like trying to stop the tide coming in. It's like the weather. It's a fact of life. Deal with it. I've heard him. I've been to his conferences. I've heard him get up and say to a room which includes a lot of tech people, because he's very closely connected to the tech industry, this is now the world we live in. And it feels like it's the same mistake being made again. AI and technology is not a force of nature. It is not just a determined course that humanity is on. It's the result of a set of choices, including political choices. But it does feel to me a little bit like the 90s. I mean, maybe it's unfair to pin it on Blair, but the 90s globalizers have become the tech determinists of the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. And in fact, I mean, I think probably the transformation that these new technologies are taking us through would be even much more significant than globalization. So I think the stakes are much higher. And I remember a few years ago when I was talking about how you could steer technology in a more labor-friendly way, for example, that even in sort of very sophisticated group of economists and so forth, there's lots of resistance to that, to the idea that there's no possible way you could control technology in its direction. Now, this is changing. And so the idea that technology is a direction and that depends on the choices that we make, and that we need to be conscious and very explicit about that. So I think, there is some movement in terms of making that, but it does run against the dominant tech culture. And just as before in the discussions on globalization, if you're just hanging around, earlier it was the big financial companies and the multinational corporations whose interests are aligned with a particular set of arrangements, then it becomes the line that this is not just what we're doing to benefit these groups, it's also the natural order of things. It's something that we can't help. I mean, that becomes, it avoids cognitive dissonance, and it's a nice story to have. I think we're not having the same thing, but it's very important, I think, to capture the narrative that sort of says, none of this is necessarily is happening on its own. There are sort of lots of human agency involved, because otherwise I think the stakes are even higher with AI.
Seen from somewhere like Britain, it feels like the two stories are connected as well, because part of the passivity or fatalism comes from the idea, well, something like AI, it's a global phenomenon. The companies that are building it are either American or Chinese. We're told Britain is an AI hub, but that's probably a little bit of wishful thinking. And we lack the international institutions to manage it. So what can the British government do? What can the British government do to stand up to the big technology companies? And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We didn't build the international institutions to manage this in the age of hyperglobalization. Now there's nothing we can do about it because we lack the international institutions to manage it. It's almost like we built the trap for ourselves.
And it's a false trap. I mean, I think there are, Taiwan is a country, for example, where there's very interesting experiments in using the technology in a more responsible way, both to foster democratic deliberation, but also to control and to have a certain desirable content to the type of technologies. And I think, the people who are leading this in Taiwan understand that there are, you can't just simply do this in a top-down sort of regulated kind of a way. So that's not the answer. But you need to understand the technology. And then there are many things you can do with the technology that's going to help you. It's not just necessarily a bad thing, but you have to know how to intervene and when to intervene. So even small countries, I think, have a certain amount of control and agency over this. And the other kind of defeatism is so, because it sets up the stage exactly for the kind of backlash we've had with regard to globalization, right? If you keep telling people that we have no control over it, it just falls on our lap, ready-made, and if it has any adverse consequences, it's not our doing and we can't really do anything about it, then, anybody else who comes and says, that's not true, I can, give you back your agency, we can take back control, is a much more appealing, narrative. But of course, it unleashes the demagogues as well as the more responsible type. So again, it is very much a similar kind of a story.
Can I ask you about something else that you wrote in 2000? So I think the word you used, I think you said this is a sketchy hope, but it was one possible hope, which was the possibility, you called it an alliance of convenience, a political alliance of convenience between the winners and the losers from global economic integration. And as I understood it, what would bring them together was a mutual recognition on the part of the winners that if they don't empower institutions that can push back against this a bit, there might be much more of a backlash. And from the losers, an understanding that actually, some of their agency is going to have to be channeled through those kinds of institutions. It was sketchy in 2000. It probably feels even sketchier now. Do you see any signs of it? Are there places in which a kind of mutual recognition that antagonism is not going to serve either of us, the losers or the winners, is visible or not? It doesn't seem very visible at the moment, I have to say.
It isn't. I mean, I think, as I see, the forces that are rebelling against the current order is either those who want us to return back to a kind of a 50s, 60s kind of a world where, manufacturing and an industrial working class was the basis of a middle class, equitable society.
It should be said a very male world as well.
A very male world, yes, but which we cannot return to. Or the tech right, who are basically, view tech and AI as essentially the sources of great amount of efficiency and getting rid of waste and so forth, represented by Elon Musk currently. And so that's the view that tech will take care of all of our problems. And what we need to do is basically just make sure that nobody's standing in its way. And so that kind of a future-oriented world, but I think a very dystopian world. So those seem to be the two forms that the reaction to our current discontent takes, and neither one really answers, I think, the critical questions. I mean, I think the critical question is, how do you create decent societies where you're empowering the people who've been left behind and feel economically and politically disenfranchised, and that can't go by bringing manufacturing back home because that's manufacturing no longer employs a lot of people and it's not going to be the source of good jobs. So you need to have a kind of a more services-based good job society that requires a new types of industrial policies. And then from the tech right, I think it goes back to what we were saying before, that tech has a direction, and I think we need to exert democratic control over that, which is precisely what the current tech authoritarians are opposing. So I don't see really many visible signs of a sensible path forward. And of course, that has also its extension at the international stage, because I think what has happened is that as the ethno-nationalist, populist, authoritarian revolt against the established international economic rules and institutions, which has been taken to its current extreme by Donald Trump, its costs and its extremism becomes more obvious, then the tendency of centrist people then to say, oh, let's go back to hyperglobalization, instead of saying, okay, well, that's really what created our current problems. So can we find another way? So again, it's not my usual style to be pessimistic, but it is at this point, it's very difficult to identify positive tendencies that would make me optimistic.
I've got two more questions, one historical and one looking forward. So as I said, this is a series looking at different periods in the story of globalization. We recorded an episode about the late 19th century and one about the run-up to the First World War. There's a sort of conventional story that's told of that age, which, as you said, in some ways was as or more globalized. Freedom of movement, labor markets, a much less regulated international order in terms of how people could get around, though much harder to get around. So you couldn't just get on a plane and fly somewhere. But there's a conventional story which it ends in 1914 with a kind of implosion of that order, as though somehow the people who had been running it were oblivious to the fact that underneath the surface were all of these seething tensions. The historical account that we've just been given is that's a myth. They were fully aware of those tensions. They were responsible for those tensions. The people presiding over this order were also, many of them, actively looking for protectionist defenses of their national interest, and they were playing by the rules when it suited them and not otherwise. But there is at least a version which is that when globalization, economic integration goes wrong, it kind of implodes. So you said you're in a pessimistic frame of mind. Does it extend to that? Do you think these historical parallels are really a sort of distraction? The world doesn't repeat every 100 years. Or is there any part of you that is a little haunted by the first globalization story?
So the optimistic story would be to say, look, good ideas eventually surface and they win. And so Keynes looked at that experience of globalization, and I think it understood exactly what the problem with the first era of globalization was, that we had created an international financial system that prevented countries to manage their economies in a way that they would be able to fight unemployment. That was no longer sustainable in a world where you had much greater democracy, mass movements of labor, mass media, and so forth. And therefore, in 1944, in the Bretton Woods Agreement, he designs essentially a set of arrangements that say we want to safeguard the ability of national governments to manage their economies. And that general spirit prevailed under the GATT as well. So good ideas won, emerged and won. Of course, the pessimistic part of that story is that you had two world wars before that happened, right? So the question is, you can easily tell a story now of what's happening today, which is really an economic warfare between the US and China, culminating in real warfare over Taiwan or something else. And then maybe we'll have arcanes afterwards, but that's a very, very disturbing thought.
Yeah, I sometimes think the gloomiest lesson of history is that good ideas do win, but it does usually take a war to trigger the kind of institutional, it's not experimentation, it's almost you have to have leveled things to the point where the only option is experimentation. Successful institutions, political institutions, are very, very, very bad at reforming themselves. There's almost no historical evidence that very successful political institutions are good at anticipating the thing that is liable to destroy them.
You do need shock to the system. Obviously, wars are a shock to the system. And the question is whether there are others might serve a functional equivalent. I hope they can. I think, for example, right now for Europe, Trump should be that shock. I think there's a way in which the Trump shock to the world economy today might lead both China and Europe to do what they require. And, what that would mean essentially for Europe would be to go on a public investment spree, and for China to go on a consumption spree. Because, ultimately, the only way you can, for the rest of the world to adjust to Trump's desire to reduce the American trade deficit one way or another, even if it means it's impoverishing the US, is for the rest of the world to basically engage in efforts that will eliminate some of the sources of their surpluses with the United States. It just so happens that these are things that are also good for them. So it'd be good for Europe to basically ramp up its investment. Of course, defense, but also defense can crowd in private investment and innovation, as we know from America's own experience. And for China, it is good to move away from its excessively saving-driven economy and to boost consumption. So these are things that would be good for Europe and China to do. And if the Trump shock is sufficiently large, my hope would be then that they can get their act together and do something for themselves, which is something that they ought to do. The US, I think, is still hopeless in that scenario, but at least for the rest of the world, there is the possibility of adjustments that will work and put them in a better position.
It still feels to me like there are two stages to the adjustments, or two phases to the response to the shock. So the first is, say, with Europe, go on a public investment spree. This is the thing that we should do, and it would be good for us, and it makes sense in response to the shock. But then, the institutions make that very difficult. We're not sufficiently integrated. There is an absence of democracy at the level that we could get legitimate public endorsement for this. We're doing it in the face of populism. So the next phase is, in order to make it possible, we need to do the thing that doesn't seem to happen outside of wartime, which is real institutional change. And in the absence of real institutional change, it feels a little like the shock isn't going to be big enough, because it's going to get stuck between, we know what we have to do, the institutions are barriers in the way of doing it, so we'll do as much as we can.
Yeah, it's true. Again, I don't disagree with you, but if I wanted to say, what would make me optimistic is I would look at Europe's own experience, like some of the largest institutional, like the euro was a huge institutional change experiment, right? It followed on the heels of a relatively small scale currency crisis, and which nobody even necessarily remembers today, but it led to a huge institutional innovation in the form of a single currency. That's a huge, huge change for these economies. There has been significant amount of institutional innovation in Europe.
But that one to me feels like a very good example of, we live in a very experimental world in all sorts of spheres except politics. So you have that massive economic, institutional governance experiment.
Your point is really about political institutions, and I think that's right. And I would need you, political scientists, to explain that to me.
But I'm thinking back to what you said in 2000, which is there's a vision ahead where the trilemma drives actual democratic institutional change up. And that may happen over the next 100 years. 100 years is an awfully long time, but it hasn't happened over 25. Not that you said it would, I should point out.
And if I remember correctly, I ended that piece by saying that, but first we would have the wars of nationalism before that.
National secession, you said. That was the word you used. So very last question, because to end on a more optimistic note, as you said, you've written about what would a good jobs economy look like in the age of technological innovation, but also you've written recently about what would sort of good globalization look like, something more minimal. I think that's the word you use, more constrained. Certainly not the hyper version and not the hyperbolic rhetoric around it. Could you just sketch, in an optimistic mode, wave your magic wand, what a good jobs, good globalization economy would look like, say, in the United States?
I think the good jobs part of it is essentially the deployment of a lot of new technologies, AI and digital technologies that empowers less than college educated workers to perform tasks that, they wouldn't be able to perform otherwise. That includes everything from care workers that can do jobs that today only registered nurses or physicians can do, to retail workers or workers in logistics or wholesale trade, to a much greater agency in how they design their own working environment in ways that gives them both more autonomy but also makes the workplace more productive. Using technology to empower a whole range of workers and also small business. A lot of jobs are created in small business, mom and pop stores, where I think technology can be very and training. So there are a lot of the provision of public inputs, including technology, to make the bulk of jobs of the future more productive, better, greater agency. So that's would be, I think, the good jobs side. I think the global economy side, which interestingly, because the global economy in some sense becomes less relevant because most of those jobs are in sheltered sectors. They are in services. They don't enter trade. So going forward, really, we should have fewer conflicts between the requirements of global economy, trade integration, because after all, manufacturers trade, that's not really where, of course, you need that in the green transition and for technology and innovation, manufacturing will be very important, but for creating good jobs, I think in many ways it's less significant. But I think national security and possible conflicts around green subsidies, green industrial policies where are going to be the points of tension in the global economy. And there, I think to manage those, I think we need to figure out some new rules of the road or new traffic rules. I like the doctrine that was articulated by President Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, which was the notion of small yard, high fence, which is to say a system in which countries explicitly and transparently specify what are the goods or services which are of significant national security, other critical importance to them, and are willing to protect them because of those high priority placed on them. But that, they're both explicit about why they're doing it so that their trade partners can understand the rationale, and also that they're disciplined by this doctrine of small yard, high fence, which is that the yard is kept small so it doesn't keep expanding and expanding. And so I think there's a way in which you can structure the relationship among major powers where countries explain to each other in a kind of a reason-giving way as to why they're doing certain things and why in certain sectors they're not going to be as open as in others, and that they explicitly restrain themselves from policies that are explicitly beggar thy neighbor in the sense of very zero-sum policies. I benefit only because they lose. But if you're pursuing policies that in response to your environmental agenda and your national security agenda that are primarily looking out for the sanity of your economy and your environmental policies, those are things that are not necessarily conflictual, as long as there is a background of back and forth and mutual reason giving. So that would be my world of peaceful economic coexistence, where the rules are generally loose. There are a few norms that we try to upheld, no explicit beggar thy neighbor policies, but otherwise considerable amount of room for countries to pursue their own economic social objectives, but in a context where they feel they have to engage in a kind of a dialogue with their trade partners where they're explaining why they're doing and what.
And then we just need some politicians to come along to sell it. I mean, small yard, high fence, it's a good conceptual slogan. I don't think it's a vote winner, I have to say. It sounds, in an age of populism, the thing that you need on top of that then is the politician who can sell it.
No, absolutely. And I think, it's not a seller. It doesn't really address the concerns of most people. So I think it's what we need the politicians for is to come and say explicitly, look, this is where I'm going to be creating jobs because that's where the jobs really are, and provide concrete examples of that and to counter the snake oil merchants who basically say, we're just going to bring manufacturing back and it's going to create millions of jobs.
Thank you so much for all of the feedback that we've had on this series and the suggestions and questions as well. We are a tiny team at PPF, but we do read all of the messages that we get from you. I'm sorry we're not able to reply to all of them. And we do collate all of the suggestions, brilliant suggestions often, about things that we could do in future. I am going to be trying trying to answer some of the questions that we've had about this series, about globalization, but also about Donald Trump and about what's going on in the world of politics in 2025. And that will be coming out on Saturday as a bonus episode on PPF+. So if you'd like to hear that Q&A to accompany this series, you just need to sign up to PPF+ by clicking on the link in the show description or going to our website, ppfideas.com. You'll get that episode, you'll get all of our bonus episodes, and you'll get ad-free listening. Do please join PPF+. We really value it. Next time in our regular slot, we're starting a new series. It's going to be called Politics on Trial, and it is about political trials, from Socrates to Marine Le Pen across history in different times, places, political systems, settings, trials of tyrants, trials of ordinary people, trials of people for their beliefs, trials of people for their genuine crimes. I'm going to be talking about all of the different ways in which, when politics collides with law and finds itself in a courtroom, all sorts of things are revealed, including often the power and legitimacy of the political system itself. That's next time. Do join us for all of that. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.